Ancient Roman architecture developed different aspects of ancient Greek architecture and newer technologies such as the arch and the dome to make a new architectural style. Roman architecture flourished throughout the empire during the Pax Romana. Its use of new materials, particularly concrete, was a very important feature. Roman architecture covers the period from the establishment of the Roman Republic in 509 BC to about the 4th century AD, after which it becomes reclassified as late antique or Byzantine architecture. Most of the many surviving examples are from the later period. Roman architectural style continued to influence building in the former empire for many centuries, and the style used in Western Europe beginning about 1000 is called Romanesque architecture to reflect this dependence on basic Roman forms. The ancient Romans were responsible for significant developments in housing and public hygiene. For example, their public and private baths and latrines, underfloor heating in the form of the hypocaust, mica glazing, and piped hot and cold water. History. Background factors such as wealth and high population densities in cities forced the ancient Romans to discover new architectural solutions of their own. The use of vaults and arches, together with a sound knowledge of building materials, enabled them to achieve unprecedented successes in the construction of imposing infrastructure for public use. Examples include the aqueducts of Rome, the baths of Diocletian, and the baths of Caracalla, the basilicas and Colosseum. These were reproduced at a smaller scale in most important towns and cities in the empire. Some surviving structures are almost complete, such as the town walls of Lugo in Hispania Tarraconensis, now northern Spain. The ancient Romans intended that community buildings should be made to impress and amaze, as well as perform a public function. The Romans did not feel restricted by Greek aesthetic axioms alone in achieving these objectives. The Pantheon is an example of this, particularly in the version rebuilt by Hadrian, which remains perfectly preserved, and which were over the centuries that has served, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, as the inspiration for countless public buildings. The same emperor left his mark on the landscape of northern Britain when he built a wall to mark the limits of the empire. And after further conquests in Scotland, the Antonine Wall was built to replace Hadrian's Wall. Influences. The Romans were indebted to their Etruscan neighbors and forefathers who supplied them with a wealth of knowledge essential for future architectural solutions, such as the use of hydraulics and the construction of arches. The Romans absorbed Greek architectural influence both directly and indirectly. The influence is evident in many ways, for example, in the introduction and use of the triclinium in Roman villas as a place and manner of dining. The Romans were also known to employ Greek engineers to construct Roman buildings. Roman Architectural Revolution. The Roman Architectural Revolution, also known as the Concrete Revolution, was the widespread use in Roman architecture of the previously little-used architectural forms of the arch, vault, and dome. For the first time in history, the potential was fully exploited in the construction of a wide range of civil engineering structures, public buildings, and military facilities. These included amphitheaters, aqueducts, baths, bridges, circuses, dams, domes, harbors, and temples. A crucial factor in this development, which saw a trend toward monumental architecture, was the invention of Roman concrete, which led to the liberation of shapes from the dictates of the traditional materials of stone and brick. Architectural features. The Roman use of the arch and their improvements in the use of concrete and bricks facilitated the building of the many aqueducts throughout the empire, such as the Aqueduct of Segovia and the 11 aqueducts in Rome itself, including the Aqua Claudia and Annia Novis. The same concepts produced numerous bridges, some of which are still in daily use, for example the Puente Romano at Mérida in Spain, and the Pont Julian and the bridge at Vaison-la-Romaine, both in Provence, France. The dome permitted construction of vaulted ceilings without crossbeams and made possible large covered public space such as public baths and Basilicas. The Romans based much of their architecture on the dome, such as Hadrian's Pantheon in the city of Rome, the Baths of Diocletian, and the Baths of Caracalla. The use of arches that spring directly from the tops of columns was a Roman development, seen from the 1st century AD. That was very widely adopted in medieval Western, Byzantine and Islamic architecture. Art historians such as Gottfried Richter have since the 1920s identified the most important Roman architectural innovation as the Triumphal Arch. This symbol of power was transformed and utilized within the Christian basilicas when the Roman Empire of the West was on its last legs. The arch was set before the altar to symbolize the triumph of Christ and the afterlife. The arch is seen in aqueducts, especially in the many surviving examples, such as the Pont du Gard, the aqueduct at Segovia and the remains of the aqueducts of Rome itself. Their survival is testimony to the durability of their materials and design. The Romans first adopted the arch from the Etruscans, and implemented it in their own building. An arch transmits load evenly and is still commonly used in architecture today. Domes. The Romans were the first builders in the history of architecture to realize the potential of domes for the creation of large and well-defined interior spaces. Domes were introduced in a number of Roman building types such as temples, thermae, palaces, morsilli and later also churches. Half-domes also became a favored architectural element and were adopted as apses in Christian sacred architecture. Monumental domes began to appear in the 1st century BC in Rome and the provinces around the Mediterranean Sea. Along with vaults, they gradually replaced the traditional post and lintel construction which makes use of the column and architrave. The construction of domes was greatly facilitated by the invention of concrete, a process which has been termed the Roman architectural revolution. Their enormous dimensions remained unsurpassed until the introduction of structural steel frames in the late 19th century. Mosaics. On his return from campaigns in Greece, the general Sulla brought back what is probably the most well-known element of the early imperial period, the mosaic, a decoration made of colorful chips of stone inserted into cement. This tiling method took the empire by storm in the late 1st century and the 2nd century, and in the Roman home joined the well-known mural in decorating floors, walls, and grottos with geometric and pictorial designs. There were two main techniques in Greco-Roman mosaic. Opus vermiculatum used tiny tesserae, typically cubes of 4 mm or less, and was produced in workshops in relatively small panels which were transported to the site glued to some temporary support. The tiny tesserae allowed very fine detail, and an approach to the illusionism of painting. Often small panels called emblemata were inserted into walls or as the highlights of larger floor mosaics in coarser work. The normal technique, however, was opus tesseratum, using larger tesserae, which were laid on site. There was a distinct native Italian style using black on a white background, which was no doubt cheaper than fully colored work. A specific genre of Roman mosaic obtained the name maceroton. It represented an optical illusion of the leftovers from a feast on the floor of reach houses. Hypocaust. A hypocaust was an ancient Roman system of underfloor heating, used to heat houses with hot air. The Roman architect Vitruvius, writing about the end of the 1st century BC, attributes their invention to Sergius Orata. Many remains of Roman hypocausts have survived throughout Europe, Western Asia, and Northern Africa. The hypocaust was an invention which improved the hygiene and living conditions of citizens, and was a forerunner of modern central heating. Hypocausts were used for heating hot baths, houses and other buildings, whether public or private. The floor was raised above the ground by pillars, called pilastacks, with a layer of tiles, then a layer of concrete, then another of tiles on top, and spaces were left inside the walls so that hot air and smoke from the furnace would pass through these enclosed areas and out of flues in the roof. thereby heating but not polluting the interior of the room. Roman roofs in Sicily. Truss roofs presumably appeared as early as 550 BC. Their potential was fully realized in the Roman period, which saw trussed roofs over 30 wide, spanning the rectangular spaces of monumental public buildings such as temples, basilicas, and later churches. Such spans were 3 times as wide as the widest prop and lintel roofs, and only surpassed by the largest Roman domes. The largest truss roof by span of ancient Rome covered the Aula Regia, built for Emperor Domitian on the Palatine Hill, Rome. The timber truss roof had a width of 31.67 meters, slightly surpassing the postulated limit of 30 meters for Roman roof constructions. Tie-beam trusses allowed for much larger spans than the older prop and lintel system, and even concrete vaulting. 9 out of the 10 largest rectangular spaces in Roman architecture were bridged this way, the only exception being the groin-vaulted Basilica of Maxentius. Spiral stairs. The spiral stair is a type of stairway which, due to its complex helical structure, was introduced relatively late into architecture. Although the oldest example dates back to the 5th century BC, it was only in the wake of the influential design of Trajan's column that this space-saving new type permanently caught hold in Roman architecture. Apart from the triumphal columns in the imperial cities of Rome and Constantinople, other types of buildings such as temples, thermae, basilicas and tombs were also fitted with spiral stairways. Their notable absence in the towers of the Aurelian Wall indicates that, although used in medieval castles, they did not yet figure prominently in Roman military engineering. By late antiquity, separate stair towers were constructed adjacent to the main buildings, as in the Basilica of San Vitale. The construction of spiral stairs passed on both to Christian and Islamic architecture. Modern influences. During the Baroque and the Renaissance periods, Roman and Greek architectural styles again became fashionable, not only in Italy, but all over Europe. Roman influences may be found around us today, in banks, government buildings, great houses, and even small houses. Perhaps in the form of a porch with Doric columns and a pediment, or in a fireplace or a mosaic shower floor copied from an original in Pompeii or Herculaneum. The mighty pillars, domes and arches of Rome echo in the New World too, where in Washington, D.C. we see them in the Capitol building, the White House, the Lincoln Memorial and other government buildings. All across the U.S. the seats of regional government were normally built in the grand traditions of Rome, with vast flights of stone steps sweeping up to towering pillared porticos, with huge domes gilded or decorated inside with the same or similar themes that were popular in Rome. In wealthy provincial parts of the U.S. such as the Great Plantations of 18th and 19th century, there too the pillars and porticos, the symmetrical facades with their pilasters, the domes and statuary that would have seemed familiar to Caesar and Augustus. In Britain, a similar enthusiasm has seen the construction of thousands of neoclassical buildings over the last 5 centuries, both civic and domestic, and many of the grandest country houses and mansions are purely classical in style, an obvious example being Buckingham Palace. Materials. Tile-covered concrete quickly supplanted marble as the primary building material, and more daring buildings soon followed, with great pillars supporting broad arches and domes rather than dense lines of columns suspending flat architraves. The freedom of concrete also inspired the colonnade screen, a row of purely decorative columns in front of a load-bearing wall. In smaller-scale architecture, concrete's strength freed the floor plan from rectangular cells to a more free-flowing environment. Most of these developments are described by Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century AD in his work De Architectura. Roman brick. The Romans made fired clay bricks, and the Roman legions, which operated mobile kilns, introduced bricks to many parts of the empire. Roman bricks are often stamped with the mark of the legion that supervised their production. The use of bricks in southern and western Germany, for example, can be traced back to traditions already described by the Roman architect Vitruvius. Roman brick was almost invariably of a lesser height than modern brick, but was made in a variety of different shapes and sizes. Shapes included square, rectangular, triangular and round, and the largest bricks found have measured over 3 feet in length. Ancient Roman bricks had a general size of 1.5 Roman feet by 1 Roman foot, but common variations up to 15 inches existed. Other brick sizes in ancient Rome included 24 x 12 x 4, and 15 x 8 x 10. Ancient Roman bricks found in France measured 8 x 8 x 3. The Constantine Basilica in Trier is constructed from Roman bricks 15 square by 1.5 thick. There is often little obvious difference between Roman bricks used for walls on the one hand, and tiles used for roofing or flooring on the other, so archaeologists sometimes prefer to employ the generic term ceramic building material. The Romans perfected brick making during the 1st century of their empire and used it ubiquitously, in public and private construction alike. The Romans took their brick-making skills everywhere they went, introducing the craft to the local populations. In the British Isles, the introduction of Roman brick by the ancient Romans was followed by a 600 to 700 year gap in major brick production. Roman concrete. Although concrete had been used on a minor scale in Mesopotamia, Roman architects perfected Roman concrete and used it in buildings where it could stand on its own and support a great deal of weight. The first use of concrete by the Romans was in the town of Cosa sometime after 273 BC. Ancient Roman concrete was a mixture of lime mortar, aggregate, pozzolana, water, and stones, and was stronger than previously used concrete. The ancient builders placed these ingredients in wooden frames where they hardened and bonded to a facing of stones or bricks. When the framework was removed, the new wall was very strong, with a rough surface of bricks or stones. This surface could be smoothed and faced with an attractive stucco or thin panels of marble or other colored stones called revetment. Concrete construction proved to be more flexible and less costly than building solid stone buildings. The materials were readily available and not difficult to transport. The wooden frames could be used more than once, allowing builders to work quickly and efficiently. Though most would consider concrete the Roman contribution most relevant to the modern world, the empire's style of architecture can still be seen throughout Europe and North America in the arches and domes of many governmental and religious buildings. Citation needed. City design. The ancient Romans employed regular or orthogonal structures on which they molded their colonies. They probably were inspired by Greek and Hellenic examples, as well as by regularly planned cities that were built by the Etruscans in Italy. The Romans used a consolidated scheme for city planning, developed for military defense and civil convenience. The basic plan consisted of a central forum with city services, surrounded by a compact, rectilinear grid of streets, and wrapped in a wall for defense. To reduce travel times, 2 diagonal streets crossed the square grid, passing through the central square. A river usually flowed through the city, providing water, transport, and sewage disposal. Hundreds of towns and cities were built by the Romans throughout their empire. Many European towns, such as Turin, preserve the remains of these schemes, which show the very logical way the Romans designed their cities. They would lay out the streets at right angles, in the form of a square grid. All roads were equal in width and length, except for 2, which were slightly wider than the others. One of these ran east-west, the other north-south, and they intersected in the middle to form the center of the grid. All roads were made of carefully fitted flagstones and filled in with smaller, hard-packed rocks and pebbles. Bridges were constructed where needed. Each square marked off by 4 roads was called an insula, the Roman equivalent of a modern city block. Each insula was 80 yards square, with the land within it divided. Most insulae were given to the first settlers of a Roman city, but each person had to pay to construct his own house. The city was surrounded by a wall to protect it from invaders and to mark the city limits. Areas outside city limits were left open as farmland. At the end of each main road was a large gateway with watchtowers. A portcullis covered the opening when the city was under siege, and additional watchtowers were constructed along the city walls. An aqueduct was built outside the city walls. The development of Greek and Roman urbanization is relatively well known, as there are relatively many written sources, and there has been much attention to the subject, since the Romans and Greeks are generally regarded as the main ancestors of modern Western culture. It should not be forgotten, though, that there were also other cultures with more or less urban settlements in Europe, primarily of Celtic origin. Among these, there are also some that appear to have been newly planned, such as the Lusatian town of Biskupin in Poland.